let's get to it for today. Okay, today I'll be talking majorly on virtual network and what a virtual network really means. Also, I'll be talking on what are the essential things needed in creating a virtual network, what are the things a virtual network can do, and why is it important to anything cloud infrastructure. So let me start with understanding what virtual network means. You can call it in Azure, you can call it virtual network, or in the short form called VNet. That's the short format. It still means a virtual network. So what a virtual network literally means. So a virtual network is a logically isolated network in Azure where you deploy resources like virtual machines, app services, with and databases. Let me just give you a summary of what I just said. So a virtual network is a resource in Azure that handles anything that involves networking. That's what a virtual network really does. Anything that involves networking, the processes around networking, and uh, managing your network processes on the cloud. That's what a virtual network does. So it is like a background layer that every other resources are deployed and connected to. For instance, you have your virtual machine is connected to your virtual network. Your virtual machine can't exist without a virtual network. It's going to be a non-existing virtual machine because it needs that virtual machine for you to be able to connect to your virtual network. I mean, for you to be able to connect to the virtual machine, and also for it to be able to for the virtual machine to be able to do some of its own requirements and processes. Also, app services like function apps, logic apps, and all those app services, some of them also need integration with the virtual network for them to perform some particular processes like communicating to a particular uh, resource, communicating to a particular DNS, and so on and so forth. So that's another thing when it comes to virtual network. Those resources need access to virtual network, and they need those virtual networks to be able to get those things done. Also, your databases, like for instance, when you are creating a database in Azure, it's going to tell you that which virtual network it's going to be integrated with for it to be able to perform its function. So that's about that. That's just an elementary explanation of virtual network and what it's really meant for. So now I will talk about IP addresses. So when you want to create a virtual network, one of the things you need to have in mind is the address space. That's when the IP address you want to allocate to that virtual network when creating a virtual network. So I'll walk you through a demo of creating a virtual network. So I'll just do that and just show you some of things in the virtual network. Okay, for instance, you want to create a virtual network in Azure now. You go to your virtual networks or just search for it in the search icon here, virtual network. And it brings up virtual networks, and you just click on create new. So you just create a new virtual network. So some of the things you need to put in when you are creating your virtual network, mainly you have to select your subscription, which we have done. You have to select the resource group which you want to create your virtual network in. Like for instance, I want to create in a training resource group. I can name my virtual network DevOps Bootcamp. I'm sorry. DevOps Bootcamp 2026. And VNet. So East2US, that's okay. The next thing is security. This virtual network encryption process, Azure Bastion. I will talk about all this when I'm talking about the virtual network, literally. Also, I will talk again. Let's move to the IP address. So IP addresses. So when creating virtual network, one of the things I want you to put in mind is you need a IP address. So, and also to help you, I'll just glance through what IP address calculator does for you when you are creating a virtual network processes. For instance, you want to create a virtual network and you have to create an IP address for it. So let me look at this. So I want to see how many IP address I will get for 10.0.0.0/16. So let me now calculate it. Okay, valid IP address. Sorry, calculate address. Okay, this is a /30. Let me use the one I can select. I want to use /16. Calculate. So if my IP address is 10.0.0 and I'm using a /16, I will get this amount of IP addresses, total amount, which is 65,536, and the usable ones are 65,534. So I talked about something earlier on last week, and which I mentioned that the first IP address and the last one won't be able to you won't be able to use it. So once you have this amount of IP address, the total number of IP addresses, just subtract 2 from it, and you get the total amount of usable IP addresses. Also, I talked about the more you have your CIDR notation increasing, meaning that you're having something like /17, /18, /20, and so on, the more the number increases, the lower the number of IP addresses you will get. And the less the numbers are, the CIDR notation number is, the higher IP addresses you get. So that's how it works. So you can get /15, /13, and so on and so forth. But no, the more you increase in the numbers, the less IP addresses you get. And also, the more you decrease in CIDR notation numbers, the more IP addresses you get. Let me give you lastly, let's use this one, /32. Same IP address using /32. You are going to get you will get just no total number of IP addresses, just one, and that one is not even usable. So that's just a sample for you to use. Okay, in this process, we'll be using /16 for creating our IP address, and it's going to give us 65,536 IP addresses, which I explained last time. I said that the first and the last IP address, subtract 2 from the amount of IP address you get from this, and you get 65,534 IP addresses that you can use. Also, you are going to create a subnet, a default cell subnet to be created. Here it is giving us an option of using /24. So 24 means that you are going to have 256 IP addresses out of this amount of IP addresses that you have in your virtual network. So most of the time, there is high tendency that you won't be able to consume the amount of IP addresses available in your virtual network for some reasons, because of we don't expect you to have a resource that use this amount of IP address. But if you have, that's fine. So that's that. That's about that. So the next thing we want to talk about is tags, and you review and create your your virtual network. So I will want to use an existing virtual network to just do training for today. So instead of creating a new one, I'll just go to our existing virtual network, which we have in here. So this is how the virtual network will look like once it's been created. So let me just expand this. Okay. So while we wait for this to load, I will just explain some of the things that you should understand about a virtual network. So once you have a virtual network, in the terms of your networking process, I can say the foundation of your networking process in Azure majorly starts with a virtual network. You must have your virtual network ready. You must ensure that it is secured and it is configured correctly. Please note that it is configured correctly. So you should be able to prevent attacks and someone trying to access unwanted access to your resources in Azure. So this is an overview of a virtual network that we've created. Now you can see the details of the virtual network, the address space, which I talked about initially. We have the resource group, the location, the subnets, and so on and so forth. This is just a general parameter of your virtual network. I'm going to start explaining every uh, item on the blade here, virtually a good number of the items on the blade here that are essential for us in terms of our networking. So firstly, I want to talk about address space. Address space, which I mentioned earlier. In address space, it talks about uh, your address allocation. In this place, you are getting that you're having a this our virtual network is having a address space which is overlapping with another virtual network. I will talk about it when we get to a place where we are going to be having how to troubleshoot these issues that has to do with IP addresses overlapping. We'll talk about it later. So yeah, we'll be talking about address spaces. This talks about your address range, meaning that when you have your IP address range of 10.0.0.0/16 is going to give you 65,536 IP addresses where I talked about, and they will run from this IP address range to this. You can see the details about it in your address space. On that thing again, you can see here is your virtual network peering. Virtual network peering, let me just explain what that really means. So when you have two virtual networks and you want resources on these two virtual networks to be able to communicate to each other, like for instance, in the virtual network A, you have one virtual machine there called virtual machine A. In virtual network B, you have a database called database B that's in your virtual network B. You want that your virtual machine A to be able to communicate with your database B. One of the easiest way to do it is just pair those two uh, virtual networks together by doing VNet pairing. VNet pairing. I will try to drop a document about VNet pairing also on the chat also. VNet pairing. So what VNet pairing majorly entails is ensuring that two virtual networks can be able to what? Communicate with each other. Resources in virtual network A can communicate with resources in virtual network B. So that's what virtual network pairing occur. Another thing again I want to talk about in terms of pairing is that you can't pair two virtual networks having the same address space. Please note, if you have a virtual network that has an IP address space of 10.0.0.0/16, you can't pair with another virtual network that's having the same address space. You'll be having something called an overlapping. You get it? So you can look at these details here. This is I can't pair this particular virtual network with this virtual network called personal VNet because of their IP addresses are overlapping. Let me just give you an example of this particular virtual network it's talking about. Please just give us a second. Okay, why that loads? I think you get my description about when you have an overlapping with two IP addresses having two virtual networks having similar or the same IP address range. Personal virtual network. So you can see that this virtual network is having same IP address 10.0.0.0, similar to what Bootcamp virtual network is having. So you can't pair this particular virtual network with this particular virtual network because they are having the same IP address, irrespective of the slash address count that they are having. Please note that irrespective of the address counts that they are having, you can't pair two virtual networks that are having the same address range or address space. Good. That's about that. The next thing again I want to talk about is subnets. 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 So when you have a virtual network, a virtual machine cannot literally connect directly to a virtual network. A virtual machine can be connected to a subnet, and a subnet exists inside a VNet or virtual network. Let me give you an instance, which I explained last week. In your street, in a street, you understand? In a street, you have different houses. You understand? In that the same in that street, you have different houses, and in that houses you have different rooms. Let's use that scenario. You have different rooms or flats or and so on. In that flat, you can have a TV, a television. You can have a refrigerator and so on. You can't directly connect your refrigerator to your transformer. No, it won't work that way. It's not ideal to do. What you need to do is that you have to connect your refrigerator or your home appliances to your a particular station that you have in your house, like maybe to your meter or your this thing, I don't know, a power station you have in your house. Is that power station that is not connected to the transformer that you have in that your street? Let's say that transformer in your street is called a virtual network. From that transformer, electricity move from that transformer to your substation that you have in your house. You understand? And from that substation you have in your house, you can now connect to your various rooms and appliances and so on. So that's how it is. A virtual machine cannot connect directly to a transformer, quote and unquote, meaning that it can't connect directly to a virtual network, but it can connect to a subnet, and that subnet is existing inside a virtual network. So that is what a subnet literally does for you. And when you are creating a subnet, for instance, there are some parameters I want you to look into when you are creating a subnet. For instance, I want to show you one of it. Like now, I want to create a subnet called subnet test. Sorry, white load. So when you are creating it, while you are creating a subnet, you need to understand some things. You must know, what am I using this subnet for? Please note, quote and unquote, what am I using this subnet for? The way I will create a power station for a house with just a commercial house whereby people live will be different from the way I will create a power station for a company. You understand? The power station for a company in that particular street, we need something, some dedicated parameters to create that power station for that company in that street. But for a normal house that people just live in, I will have to create the general power station for it. That's how it is when you are creating a subnet. If I'm creating a subnet that is dedicated for some particular usage, there's a way I will create that subnet. But when I'm creating a subnet for a general use, like a general use, I can create a subnet to be the general kind of subnet generally. But I just want to show you the difference between the two, the general subnet and a dedicated subnet. Now, when you are creating a general subnet, please wait while it load. When you are creating a general subnet, you can see the subnet purpose. You can put an icon here. You can see this icon says choose a template to set values for which account Azure services, or choose default to customize it. So look at me, if I'm creating it for general purpose, I can just leave it on default. I can use it, call this general purpose. Oh, sorry. Understand? Include the IPv4. It gave me a particular IP address range I can use. I can say this for the VNet. This is the VNet IP address range. This is my IP address for the subnet. I can say I just want something, a very low IP address, 29. You understand? And this is a general purpose subnet, and that's everything I need to do. And I've created this general purpose subnet. You can look at it. So this is a general purpose subnet that I created here. You can see, so there's no major details around it. It's just a general purpose subnet. But when I want to create the subnet specifically for something else, like for instance, I want that subnet to be created for a Azure function app service, and so on. There's a way I will create it that it will be different. Number one, I want to create a subnet for Bastion. When I want to create a subnet for Bastion, I will have to set a subnet purpose here. I want this subnet to be majorly meant for Azure Bastion. This is it. This is the purpose of the subnet. It can be for firewall. It can be for firewall management, virtual network gateway, router service, and so on and so forth. So, for instance, I'm choosing Azure Bastion. After that, every other thing is done. I don't need to do any other thing. I'll just click add, and I've created the subnet majorly for Azure Bastion. I'll talk about Bastion when I'm talking about Azure Compute and so on and so forth later. Now, let me talk about the next one, which is Azure delegation. I can create a general purpose subnet and say that I want it to be delegated majorly for another thing. For instance, I want to create this one, general purpose app service. General purpose app service. I can create this. I just need just small IP address, just 8. And on the delegation aspect of it, I can set a network security group for it. If I have a NSG, I can assign an NSG. I'll talk about NSG later to it. I can assign a route table to it if I have one also. Now I want to talk about delegation mainly. Delegation means that this subnet I'm creating, there's some particular type of resources that I want it to be used for. For instance, I want to create a subnet that's mainly used for app services. App services include function app service, and all those kind of services that are serverless applications. Now, for me creating a subnet for app service and so on, I'll have to choose what's called server farm. I'm coming. So when you have a server farm delegations are majorly used for app services. They are majorly used for, which I explained. One of them is function app and so on and so forth. You have some other ones also, like for SQL database. For SQL database, If I want to create database, SQL databases majorly on that subnet, you have something called database server. If it's SQL database server I want to create, I'll have to put the delegation to be Microsoft dot data storage on something like that. Or yeah, DB for my SQL server. You can see this is for database. If I want to do something like Postgres, also Postgres database, I can choose for Postgres database server. If it's something I want to do for MySQL, I can choose this also for this is for databases. And also please note, depending on the kind of resources you want to create, ensure that the delegation is done appropriately. The delegation is done appropriately. If it's a general purpose uh, subnet you want to create, like you want to use it for virtual machine and for any other resources that doesn't need delegation, you don't need all these things. I've showed you how to create one for general purpose and the ones that involve delegation. So here is one of the sample of the one that involve delegation that has been created here. This is called web app. You can see it has a delegation called Azure Server Farm. So this one is majorly web server farm. This one is majorly for something like function apps. Um, you have function apps, app services, static web apps, and so on and so forth. Now, next thing I want to talk about here is service endpoint. Service endpoint. Please just read these details here. It says that create service endpoint policies to allow traffic to specific note, specific Azure resources from your virtual network over service endpoint. This one means that you have specific resources that you want this subnet to be able to connect to. You understand? Now you want it to be able to connect to storage accounts. This is Microsoft storage, this is that storage account, and so on. You have SQL databases. You want it to be able to connect to key vaults. You want it to be able to connect to just Microsoft Service Bus and so on. So yeah, that's what Service Bus literally does for you. I will just talk about it glancing through. The next one I want to talk about is Basting. I talked about Basting when I just glanced through it when we were creating subnets. So what Basting does this process of you have a virtual machine. To connect to a virtual machine, you have different ways. Number one, you connect to it. If it's a Windows virtual machine, you can connect to it using RDP, remote desktop. And that one you can use that one on port 3389. But when you are connecting to a Linux virtual machine, you have to connect to it using SSH, and that's port 22. That's how you connect to all those virtual machines using your public IP addresses. You understand? Public IP address. I'll talk about it when we are talking about compute, Microsoft Compute. That involves virtual machines and the other resources associated to it. But if you want to connect to it securely and you don't want people to be able to connect to it generally, like me connecting to the virtual machine from my house on my public IP address, I can connect it to it using something called Basting. So I'm going to drop the documents around Basting for you on the group also. So what Basting does is that it allows me to RDP for Windows virtual machine. I can remote desktop to that virtual machine from the web browser on HTML5. I can be able to connect to that virtual machine, control the virtual machine, do my workflow in my virtual machine and so on, without doing remote desktop from my own personal system. So that's what Basting does. And also it works for SSH also. I can use it to SSH to the virtual machine also. Now, I don't think we have any ever available virtual machine here that I can use to show you how it works. But when we get to the aspect of Microsoft Compute, I'm going to talk more about it. Now, DDoS protection is just denial of service just to prevent attack. Like you have denial when people flooding your virtual network to deny services from working appropriately. I think that's about that. The next thing I want to talk about is DNS. So Sometimes you have something called a DNS server. I know I don't want to bore you guys about the whole process. So you can use a general DNS provided by Microsoft, you understand? And you can use something called a custom DNS. Like for instance, you have a DNS server and you want all requests that pass through your virtual network to route through that DNS server. You can just add that DNS server. You can change your virtual network to a custom DNS server and put in the DNS server IP addresses. So, like for instance, when they want to call google.com from your virtual network, it is going to route through your DNS server to check where is google.com and so on and so forth. But I don't want to bore you with these processes of DNS and how it works. I have talked also about peering when I talked about peering this particular virtual network, Bootcamp 2025 virtual network, and this other virtual network called personal virtual network. So you can go back to watch the video and listen to the other things I talked about peering and what you do and what you don't do for peering purposes. Also, let's move on to service endpoints. Service endpoints. I talked about service endpoints when I was talking about creating of subnets and what they are used for. And I gave you an example. I showed you in one of the virtual network, one of the subnets description also and what it is used for. Also, I want to talk about private endpoints. Private endpoints. So when you have resources, one or two resources in Azure, and you want them to be able to talk to each other, but not over the internet, but through Microsoft's networking process. Like now, I have a, a virtual machine in subscription A, and that's where it exists. And I have another virtual machine in subscription B on that different region. And I want those two virtual machines to be able to speak to each other. But I don't want to pair the two VNets together, maybe due to some reasons. And also, I don't want them to communicate with each other using the general internet. I can use private endpoints to connect those resources together over Microsoft backbone internet. You understand? Over Microsoft's own internet. So that is what private endpoint really does. Also, I want to talk about okay, this is just the properties and this is the locks. Locks is just needed for when you want to lock the resource so it will not nobody will be able to delete it or nobody will be able to edit it based on the kind of lock you want to create. For instance, I can give it a lock name and say that this lock is a read-only lock, meaning that people can only read what is in this resource and they can't update or do anything on it. Or I can say delete lock. Delete lock means that nobody can delete this virtual network because of it's already logged. So that's that about that. I will talk about you can apply lock in number one. You can apply lock on a resource. You can apply lock on a resource group. You can apply lock on a subscription. Awesome. So we'll talk about that generally in some of our lectures also. So I've talked about these little things on virtual networks, subnets, IP addresses and how they work. And also I will want to talk about NSG, but I won't be able to talk about it at length because we'll not be using it for now.